In the previous video we talked about creating a product backlog for a project, including how to decompose epic stories into more manageable chunks, and how the product owner is then responsible for deciding the order of things which are going to take place within the project. In this section we're going to look at how that happens in each individual sprint, and we're going to start by defining what a sprint actually is. Put simply, a sprint is simply a block of time within a project's overall development cycle. If we had a 12-week project, it would be reasonable to split that up into either 4 3-week projects or 6 2-week projects. And at the end of each of those blocks of time, we would hopefully have some tangible progress. These smaller projects or blocks of time, however you want to look at them, are called sprints. The idea is, at the end of each sprint, progress will have been made from the last sprint, and that progress will be all working and in a state that we could potentially hand over to a user to actually go through and use. This allows Agile to come into its own, especially by asking the product owners for feedback at the end of each sprint during what's called a sprint review meeting. Any feedback provided can then be taken into account for the remainder of the project, and if changes are necessary, we have plenty of time to actually make the changes, rather than rolling out the entire project and deciding that we want to change something at the end. So how do we actually plan for a sprint? Well, now that we have our project backlog, we're going to go through and assign each of the user stories within that backlog a score. That score is not going to be an exact calculation. It's going to include things such as how difficult and how complex the actual user story is, as well as how long each individual developer thinks it will take them to incorporate that user story into the project. So if you had one really experienced developer, they may think that a user story will take an hour to implement, whereas if you had a less experienced developer, that same user story may take them multiple hours. If there is a huge disagreement about the score, the developers would then normally talk about what would be involved in that user story, and how complex that will actually be to implement, and then as a group they will come to some sort of conclusion as to what score should be assigned to it. The product owner or the business don't actually have any part to play in this role. This is something done purely by the developers who are going to actually be the ones coding all of this solution. Once all of the stories have scores assigned to them, then a conversation will take place as to roughly where the development will be at the end of that sprint, at the end of that 2-week period or the end of that 4-week period. And this allows the developers to loosely manage the expectations of the business. So if the business came back 2 weeks later and thought that the entire project would be done, the developers would have had the opportunity to actually explain that no, only a certain part of the project will be delivered at that point. It's also important to note at this point that during the very early sprints, progress as far as the users will be concerned, or from the business's perspective, will be very slow. And this is because things at the back end must be taken into account. So for example, setting up an environment to actually create all of the project, setting up PHP, MySQL, things like that, all take time. And that time will take away from the time actually spent developing the actual product. So once the sprint objectives are roughly agreed, and the business roughly understands which user stories are going to be focused on during a specific sprint, those user stories are then typically transferred onto post-it notes and placed on a whiteboard or some other board. This whiteboard is usually split into about 5 sections. The exact number of sections and the section names can and does vary, but an example would include a section for backlog, a section for to-do, a section for in process, one for needs testing, and another for completed. The idea will be that initially every single user story will have a post-it note which is placed in the backlog section. At the start of each sprint, all of the user stories applicable to that sprint will be transferred into the to-do column. It's from this column that the developers will actually take their work. So if developer 1 decided that they were going to be responsible for task 1, they would take the post-it note out of the to-do column and put it into the in-process column, adding their name to the bottom of the post-it note. This is a visual representation of who is doing what, and if you have multiple developers working on a project, it's very easy to keep track of who is doing what. After the developer has done working on their individual user story, they will move the post-it notes from the in-process column into the needs testing column. That developer will then go ahead and move another user story from the to-do column into the in-process column, adding their name. Depending on how the team who is doing the development is actually set up, there may be a developer dedicated to doing all of the testing. If so, it will be their responsibility to take work out of the needs testing column and actually test it. If it passes all of the applicable tests, it will be moved into the completed column. If the team doesn't have a dedicated tester, it will be the responsibility of any other developer to do that. It's often considered bad practice for the same developer to actually develop a user story and then test it, because there hasn't at that point been an independent review of that user story, and so we only have the word of the one developer. The entire process of taking work out of the to-do column, moving it into the in-process column, into the testing column, and then into the completed column, is not time-bound. This means that when a developer has completed a task, it's their responsibility to take a new one. It's not the responsibility of the project manager to tell each of the developers exactly which piece of work that they're going to be focusing on, because each of the developers know their own skill sets far greater than the project manager will ever know them. And so this process continues throughout the duration of the entire sprint. There is, however, every single day a daily meeting, which involves every single person within the project. And this is going to be the subject of our next video, so make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss it.